presentations. So, and of course, not least the presentation we have today, which is by Adam Standring, who's a Marie Curie Fellow in the Centre for Urban Research and Austerity in Montfort University in the UK. So Adam's going to give a presentation, and then there'll be time for questions and answers at the end. If you have a burning question, I'd be grateful if you kept it to the end, because otherwise we'd have to edit out your question from our YouTube video channel. Great time.
As I mentioned to Michelle before, my project is well underway, but it's also been a bit disjointed due to some unanticipated institutional problems there. I'm here until, well, I'm going back home next week, but then I'm here for another 2-week block. So if anybody does catch me, I'm in the room over there. So if you do want to have a chat to discuss the issues in UK higher education at length, I'm more than happy to talk about that. I thought this presentation, 3 quick things. I will spend some time just to introduce myself and my background and my interests, and again, if anybody does want to catch me in the corridor and have a chat, I'm happy to do that. I'll talk a little bit about the context of the project, and then finally the paper, this paper, which is very, very much a work in progress at the moment. It's a little bit, as I said, disjointed. It's one of those places where it can go in several directions at once. So any comments, feedback, constructive questions, I'm absolutely more than welcome. So my background is in political science, public policy. I did my master's at the University of York, and I did a PhD at the New University of Lisbon. And the area that I was interested in both those phases was I was looking into drug policy. And what was particularly interesting to me was the interaction between facts and values, and how those contribute, or the role of facts and values in policy making and decision making. And this came from some experience that I had working at the European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction in Lisbon, and I was interested in my PhD at looking how different frames serve to either make the values explicit or serve to obscure the values that kind of grounded a lot of the policy making in this area. And it's particularly interesting as a little diversion in the question of drugs, because the way that this functioned was that without the kind of strong power to actually dictate what kind of drug policies member states should enact, the European Union set up a institution by which they could provide the member states with data, and so it was very much kind of a way of depoliticising the drug issue through scientific data, through evidence, as a means of kind of reframing drug policy towards being a public health issue rather than a law enforcement issue. So this is what got me thinking about this connection between facts and values, and I was very much interested in through these theories and work, literature on depoliticisation, kind of the newer wave of depoliticisation, as kind of explained by people like Peter Burnham and Colin Hay. They were particularly interested in questions around economic management, and again, they're very briefly explains, understanding of depoliticisation is how the political nature of policy making is obscured. The kind of processes and tools by which the political nature of economic management particularly was obscured through New Labour's time. And I sought to apply this immediately after my PhD to economic management. So I was looking at the bailouts. I was living in Portugal and working with my former PhD supervisor, and we had a project on bailouts and austerity. And then through bailouts and austerity, in the way that in which the kind of the values, the politics of this was obscured through that period, I wanted to kind of look at the re-emergence of values, of politics in the wake of the financial crisis. So I kind of periodized this as being, you know, the post 80s, 90s, early 2000s, was this kind of very prominent period of depoliticisation. It was the time of evidence-based policy making, the third way, what matters is what works, the idea that the politics of in any kind of policy area could very well be obscured, and the global financial crisis really was a catalyst to the end of this, and this has been described by various people, approvingly or disapprovingly, as a post-truth period, or the time where the values of politics re-emerges. So I was interested in understanding more about this, so I developed a project that was eventually funded by the Marie Curie Fellowship called CHAMP, which is Crisis, Housing and Austerity, the Emergence of a New Moral Politics. And the question here is, how do morals mediate political conflict post-global financial crisis? What are the sites and actors producing moral critique? So where is this emerging from? Who are the groups and the people who are doing this? And what is the nature of their critique? And how do multiple social struggles intersect? This is another kind of one of those emerging themes from this. It's not the case that housing exists on its own, or criticism of austerity exists on its own, but these are all interrelated with other social struggles rather. So it's important to understand how those manifest themselves and how those intersect. And what I wanted to do in this project was to bring together three bodies of literature that have been particularly important to me. So the moral sociology, or sociology of morals, people like Andrew Sayer and Luke Boltanski, looking at different scales of morals, how morals help to structure social order. I was also particularly, obviously with my background, looking at facts and values and scientific knowledge and expertise and so on, interested in literature coming from STS, so people like Sheila Jasanoff, particularly, Lindsay McCooey, Silke Beck, McHugh, looking at this kind of intersection, how facts and values can be considered, can be conceptualized as co-constructive or co-productive. And then obviously again, interested in the literature of depoliticization, the politics of crisis, people like Colin Hay, Stuart Hall as well, how crisis is framed and produced and constructed according to certain sets of values. We've also been a little productive, or tentatively productive, in writing some pieces on this, myself and Matt, who's here. We had a couple of pieces out last year, one in Soundings, Moral Crisis, Moral Critique, and we have a chapter in a book by the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. The book was on crisis and democracy, and we had a chapter where we kind of explained our ideas on the importance of kind of analysing morals, importance of morals in this. And I had a paper out with Jonathan Davis, who's now my career supervisor, in Dialogues on Human Geography in response to the pandemic. This was one of those calls that came out just as the whole world was shutting down, and it's like, please, can we analyse something very, very quickly? So we had these ideas, these talks about how crises are, co-constitutive, they're interrelated, and we need to treat the whole rather than individual symptoms. So it seemed quite appropriate there. And more recently, Matt and myself, we co-organised a panel at the recent ECPR joint sessions of workshops. It was, if I do say so myself, a very successful panel. If only for demonstrating to us the breadth of people who are actually interested in this. We've managed to bring people from a wide variety of subfields, subdisciplines in and around politics. We had ethnographers, we had political economists, we had very, very quant people, which we are not. So it was very interesting to have a very constructive conversation with people over a long period about the importance of morals in contemporary politics. So this paper, excuse me, as I said before, it's very much work in progress. It can go off in several different directions, but this is where I'm at the moment. Paper firstly seeks to, as we me and Matt have done several times now, seeks to rehabilitate or reintroduce or emphasise the importance of morals as a focus of social inquiry. Why should we be interested in morals? What do we mean by morals in the first place? And it makes three modest, say, claims about the roles of morals and moral critique in social inquiry. Firstly, the way that people view many day-to-day social interactions is through a moral lens. It's how we understand each other on a social level. So it's important we actually consider this when we're thinking about social inquiry. Morals and values are inextricably linked to knowledge, particularly as crises make social interactions less intelligible. So as crises make things more confusing, as they disrupt social orders, it's more important to actually understand about how the morals and values are actually related, because they help us to understand how crises themselves are understood. And then a more normative point, which is, again, abandoning the terrain of morals to the right, or to conservative forces or aggressive political forces, as happens very often in questions around the culture wars, which I believe you heard about a couple of weeks ago. It doesn't remove morals from politics. Standing above the fray doesn't necessarily allow us to stay clear of morals, but it removes an important tool or strategy from the left or from progressive politics. And it helps to illustrate these claims from the recent history of austerity and its impact on the housing crisis in Lisbon, Portugal. And there's two quotes which are I think worth reading in full, because they help me think about this. I don't kind of accept these quotes uncritically, but they're something that have helped kind of structure my thoughts on this. First is from Eric Olin Wright in his book Envisaging Real Utopias. He says, envisaging real utopias is a central component of a broader intellectual enterprise that can be called emancipatory social science. To call this a form of social science rather than simply social criticism or social philosophy recognises the importance for this task of systematic scientific knowledge about how the world works. The word emancipatory identifies a central moral purpose in the production of knowledge, the elimination of oppression and the creation of the conditions for human flourishing. And the second one is from the urbanist Mike Davis in his book on Los Angeles, City of Quartz. It is odd to say, but many conservatives seem to have a better grasp of Gramsci than many on the left. Above all, they understand the principle that a hegemonic politics must represent a consistent continuum of values. It must embody a morally coherent way of life. As I said, I don't accept those quotes uncritically, but I think they kind of help structure some of what is to follow, and help inform some of what is to follow. The structure of the paper, as it stands, I can go through very quickly. Looking at the importance of morals in the current conjuncture, why morals, the notion of polycrisis, so particularly why morals are important now in this time of multiple intersecting crises. Crises and moral critique, how can morals help understand, frame, produce even the crises that we're examining? And then how do we pass from moral critique to moral politics? How can morals challenge dominant discourses? And then what is very, sometimes approvingly, sometimes dismissively called sardine capitalism, how Portugal managed to mitigate austerity. A moral lens. So, at both the microsocial and the macrosocial level, morals serve an important role in making social interactions intelligible. It's how we, in our day-to-day lives, we don't make these regular, calculative, rational, immediately narrowly rational decisions about things. We think about morals in terms of how people's behaviour is, whether it's good or bad, what expectations we draw from people's behaviour, and if those justifications that people make for their behaviour kind of click, they make sense to us and we can pass on. It's something that exists in a kind of evaluative level. And morals can't be reduced to a simple measure as values. So one of the frequent comments that we get is, well, why not values? Why don't you just talk about values instead? And the conclusion that we've put is well, partially because also it's drawn, a lot of this work is drawn from work on moral economy, Andrew Sayers' work on moral economy, so we kind of, it moves up from that, it develops on that, it's in dialogue with that. But it's also the idea that values often tend to individualise beliefs, and rather we see morals as produced by actors enmeshed in multiple social webs of relationships and normative commitments, which means that the normative and the epistemic grounds for evaluation are multiple. So essentially, the morals are social. And as Hitler and Racy in their introductory paper on the sociology of morals say, focus on morals implicates a broader set of interrelated social phenomena. It includes narratives, identities, institutions, symbolic boundaries, and cognitive schemas, the way we think about things as well. Crises, morals, and knowledge. When justifying an action, agents must relate to a socially legitimate form of common good. So in Latansky and Febino's framing of this is an order of worth or a regimes of justification. Orders are multiple, there's many happening that overlap each other, spatially and temporally contingent, with some being dominant in particular times and places, but they're subject to contestation. And when they don't adequately structure a particular social interaction. So when things fail, we notice them, essentially. This is one of the things with the global financial crisis. When the bankers made all those risks, this is the narrative, this is the moral critique, when the bankers made all those risks and then the debts were socialised amongst the population, this did not compute, this was morally ran against what we were led to believe should be the moral structure of capitalism, where profits are justified because those who take the risks stand to lose their money. This was clearly not the case. It was shown, it was demonstrated to not be the case. So when these kind of fail to structure them, there's an opportunity for critique. Crises are characterised by high levels of uncertainty, opacity. We don't know what's going to happen. Decisions have to be made only with partial knowledge. That's in terms of either the nature of the problem. We don't fully understand what the problem is, how that relates to other things, or in terms of the outcomes. If there's a necessity for action or an urgency for actions, the outcomes themselves can be subject to unintended consequences and so forth. So morals, again, here are things that help us structure. They provide these kind of framework, these schema for thinking through these things. It's already what we have programmed to an extent in, and so they help us make judgment calls like that. And moments of crisis open up windows for opportunity for actors to both challenge the status quo. You know, there's something that's gone wrong, there's a failure, there's a conflict here that needs to be resolved, so we can challenge, we can think about things differently, but it also serves as an opportunity for certain actors to further embed or constrain change, because the urgency, the necessity for action, we have to do something now about this. So it can work both ways. This, again, is a site of contestation. And the current polycrisis opened up opportunities for new ways of knowing the world that are not constrained by pre-existing moral orders. So we can think also like in ways that now the combination of climate change and so forth has compelled many people to think about things in planetary terms rather than national terms or global terms. We talk about the explosion of transboundary crises, so the understanding that crises aren't bounded by geographical spaces but pass between them. Again, in the wake of the financial crisis, the moral underpinnings of capitalism as is, financial capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, however you want to call it, has been challenged. And the relationship between humans, human societies, and nature is also. So these pre-existing moral orders are, and the political horizons that come with them are being challenged. And then morals as a political tool. So this is going back to the Matt Davies quote at the beginning as well. Abandoning the terrain of morals doesn't remove morals from politics, but instead removes or obscures an important tool or strategy for change that we have. And I've been through this before, but there's a long history of progressive moral critique of capitalism to draw on, and that doesn't always imply a kind of a universalising or top-down or hierarchical moral order, but an understanding that moral critique and moral orders can emerge organically through collective engagement in concrete social struggles. And an emergent progressive moral order is apparent that rests on notions such as solidarity, a word that we kind of seems to disappear from the public discourse for a few decades and has re-emerged again. Politics of care that rejects the kind of individualising, atomising, competitive logics that are dominant at the moment. I'll skip through that because I think that we're going to get a little bit later on to talk about Portugal. It's just that this is the idea of polycrisis. We have these crises that are actually more frequent, as Flyberg says. The more frequent, they're more severe, and they exacerbate each other. They sort of spin off each other. And these crises have provoked calls from activists and international organisations, that's important, for broad social change. This is very often referred to as transformative social change. And it's one of those terms that we're seeing increasingly often without any concrete definitions of that, which is not necessarily a bad thing. We're typically more aware of what it doesn't involve rather than what it does involve. It's positioned against the idea of quick managerial techno-scientific fixes, the idea that we can just change one little thing and that will help solve the particular crisis. It's a reflection, it's an understanding of the interrelated nature of the crises that we're involved in. So again, to reiterate, crises can be moments of transformation, but they can also be moments of retrenchment. This one I can skip through, I don't really need to go. But this one, and yeah, the question of how we move from moral critique to moral politics. So the idea that dominant moral orders can be challenged through emergent sites of moral politics. We've seen this through social movements, we've seen this through think tanks, we've seen this through a change in the broader public discourse as different voices become more prominent through social media and also the mainstream media. And these combine both normative and epistemic critique of the current crisis. There's a very, very specific example that I give there related to climate change. I think it's important, the idea that these small island states that exist in the Pacific, this is a good example of this, the very existence of which is becoming impossible because of climate change and rising ocean levels. On the global scale, on the global stage rather, these small island states are really asserting their own agency to describe their predicament rather than having the nature of the crisis that they face imposed upon them by Western or global North countries. So that's one kind of prominent example of how that can happen. And it's not about simply presenting alternative rationalities on moral orders, but it's also about openly or explicitly rejecting the dominant rationalities, and particularly those that present themselves as neutral or objective or depoliticised. And again, a recent example of that is the discourse in the UK with the small boats arriving, and many activist groups, many social movements, people who are very involved in refugee rights and so on, were extremely disappointed to see the discourse emerging from the opposition, from the Labour government, that wasn't seeking to challenge the kind of broader logics of migrants coming over, but really criticised government policy on the fact that it was inefficient or impractical rather than inhumane or morally repugnant. And this is an epistemic and normative task to make that kind of critique. And housing, finally get to housing. Housing provides a wealth of empirical material for future research on this. Housing has become an increasingly important issue. Since the global financial crisis, since austerity, it wouldn't be right to suggest that it's the direct causal link there, but it's become a kind of a catalyst for this. There's a housing crisis that exists before austerity in many countries, but the austerity measures and the global financial crisis has definitely exacerbated this. So as we see, it's an increasingly global problem. I mean, it's a European problem. It's an increasingly global problem. There's many sites around Europe where this is a extremely prominent issue. Housing crises have generated resistance with a distinctly moral vocabulary. This is very often termed in ways that explicitly challenge the existing moral order. You see the challenge to the idea that houses exist as a vehicle for profit, that houses exist as an asset, a financial asset that can be removed from the idea of houses as a home for people. Increasing talk of rights, increasing assertion of people's human rights, the right to a home, the right to somewhere to live. And this is coming from across society as well. There's obviously social movements that are heavily involved in promoting this, but also think tanks in Ireland. I know you have like Task and think tanks like this that kind of blur the lines between advocacy and knowledge production. In the UK, you have think tanks like NEF, the Economics Foundation. But you also have it at the highest levels of politics as well, which sometimes can get you in trouble, as it did for the president here, when people make those kind of explicit moral claims. In the case of Lisbon, Lisbon was a country that, by many measures, suffered extremely the worst from austerity in terms of the structural reforms that were passed, in terms of the cuts. By many measures, it was one of the most badly hit by austerity. Again, this book by Capitalising on Constraints by my supervisor, Catherine Murray, and Stella Lardi and colleagues is very good on that. I don't have it there, actually, I should have put it in that one in the thing here. But Lisbon suffered extremely negatively from the consequences of austerity, with unemployment rising massively. And the way in which austerity was governed in Portugal mirrored a lot of the way that austerity was governed in a lot of places in Europe, which was that it was both governed nationally through the national state and it was governed through the local states as well. Jonathan's book on twin realism and revolt is very good on the way that the kind of the local level, municipal level made austerity governable in that. So in the case of Portugal, it's both the national state and Lisbon municipality were responsible for governing austerity in terms of the policies that they introduced, the cuts that they introduced, and also in terms of the mitigation, the policies to kind of mitigate the worst effects of that. So it's a combination of the two levels, different levels of the state there. And in the case of Lisbon, one of the policies that they adopted for this mitigation was through trying to attract both foreign direct investment and opening up Lisbon to tourism, to massive increase in tourism. There'd always been a tourist industry in Portugal, which had been important to the economy, but it had been centred usually in the south, particularly in the south of the country, in Algarve. So Lisbon was kind of seen as an undeveloped, had some undeveloped potential for this. And the way that it was framed to the population was that this is a necessity, this is important, this is the only way that we're going to be able to generate the kind of economic growth that we need to in these times, because we don't have the capacity anywhere else in the economy. And this was supplemented by various policies. So between 2009 and 2012, the centre-right government abandoned the rent controls and liberalised many rental laws, including getting rid of lifetime rents and things like that, and opened the way for the kind of touristification and the Airbnb-isation of Lisbon that we see today. It was also matched at the national level by the implementation of tax breaks for foreigners coming into to Portugal and who earned abroad. So this opens the door to these people, or this group known as digital nomads, these people who can work wherever, because they would typically work in tech or IT or something like that. And Lisbon was heavily marketed to these groups as a place to live. It was cheap to live, cheap rents. Lifestyle is high, relatively high for the costs. And this kind of miracle, if you like, was named. I mean, this was actually an approving article of it as Sardine capitalism, this way of attracting people based on the kind of cultural heritage as well of Portugal. And also, you had one of the important policies as well was the golden visas as well, so people could move from wherever in the world to Portugal as long as they invested. I think it was $500,000 in kind of a list of approved industries, but included also in real estate as well. So you could, if you invested $500,000 in real estate, you would have a visa to live and work in the country. And kind of one of the epitomes of, again, how the country was marketised was the move of Web Summit from Dublin to Lisbon. Lisbon presenting itself as this tech hub. And I don't know if anyone's read them, but the emails of Paddy Cosgrove as they were making this move from Dublin to Lisbon are available online, and they're worth a read because it talks about precisely how these cities are competing with each other to attract, to be seen as these kind of hubs for certain industries. The effects of that exacerbated what was already an existing or kind of underlying crisis. It made it much, much worse. This is a wonderful paper that came out this year on the role of the state in the touristification of Lisbon, and this is just, I've actually had to cut down the map to kind of make it a little bit more intelligible, but this is downtown Lisbon now, which is almost a desert of kind of long-term inhabitants replaced by short-term lets. You see the orange dots, probably the more prominent on here. These are tourist apartments that have 6 or more Airbnbs in a building. So there are entire neighbourhoods which are almost entirely Airbnb. The government, the national government and the municipal government resisted for a long, long time despite huge efforts in this to reform the laws on Airbnb. It was really kind of a bit of a Wild West situation for a long time. They finally kind of implemented in the last year or so some minor reforms, but this kind of continues apace, and we've seen kind of even in our locality how it's now they've given people the right to reject Airbnbs if there's like 1 or 2 in your building, but now people are just buying the entire buildings and turning them into Airbnb hotels in essence. And the rental prices, I mean, this had a detrimental effect on, obviously, on house prices and particularly on rental prices. So now it's like hugely unaffordable for people to live, which I'm assured by several people is also the same in Dublin as well. And ironically, I don't know if anyone noticed in the lobby, my poster is next to a poster from somebody complaining about PhD students not earning enough to live in Dublin, and this is exactly reflective of the discourse in Lisbon as well, where I think the average wage is something like €1,000 a month, and the average house price is now over €1,000 a month. So it's completely beyond the capacity of most people to be able to afford to live in central Lisbon. So there is a popular response to this. It has kind of generated this movement around this. There was a movement that kind of grew up around anti-austerity protests in 2011, and it's kind of exploded since then. We've seen the demonstrations becoming ever more frequent. There's now at least 1 or 2 a year. There was one less than a month ago in Lisbon that we attended, conducting a bit of participant observation in there, and it's provoked some very interesting generational or demographic. We notice the demographics of the people in protests because they are kind of very heavily, what you said, young people. I count myself as a young person still, but under 40. is kind of definitely the predominant age group here, because they're completely priced out of the housing market. We're seeing kind of also the way that in the protests it's linked to a broader critique of capitalism in there. There is this kind of very strong idea that it's not just, we don't just want a house, we want to change how profits function, how people consider the role of housing in accumulation, those kind of things. We're also seeing connections with also environmental movements. There's also connections with precarity, low wages, and so on. And we're also seeing the emergence of a few groups who are being explicitly blamed for this in kind of strong moral terms. You see on the top there, tourists aren't habitants. Tourists aren't, I'm not sure how you translate habitants, but yeah, tourists aren't people who live here. Tax the digital nomads. We're seeing definitely the kind of emergence of this strong anti-tourist, anti-digital nomad movement. And I've kind of summarised pretty much everything I said about Portugal in one slide there, so I don't need to go over it again. But this is it, that housing struggles increasingly intersect with other social struggles, and this also represents a rejection of capitalism as is, or as people feel it.